I discovered my wife had gone to a secret company party with friends, and when she saw me, she couldn't believe it, because I was there, invited at the last minute by a colleague unaware of our relationship. She was dancing with another man, laughing as if she didn't owe anything. When our eyes met, I saw panic replace euphoria. I turned my back and left, without making a scene, but taking with me the end of our story. Days later, she tried to justify it, but it was too late. Her lover disappeared as soon as he realized he would be charged, and she was left alone with the choices she made. I moved on, found a new love with calm eyes and complete presence. When she came to me, head down, I said, "I forgive you, but now someone else occupies my heart." And we moved on, she with regret, I with peace. And that's when she understood the weight of her choice. And this is where everything begins to change. Because no one betrays someone out of the blue. No one wakes up one day and decides to destroy a story. And no one, absolutely no one, is ready to deal with the consequences of a heart that breaks silently, without scandal, without screams, but that closes the door from the inside out, without warning, without promise of return. I didn't make a fuss at that party. I didn't break glasses, I didn't call anyone names, I didn't expose anything. I simply left, and with that, I took away her right to continue being called mine. What she didn't know, and perhaps will never fully understand, is that true ending doesn't come with screams. It comes with silence. It comes with a blank stare. It comes with the simple act of turning away. And in that dry gesture, filled with pain but also with decision, she lost everything. She lost the man she was sure would be there forever. On the way home that night, as I drove aimlessly, listening to the song she used to sing off-key while washing the dishes, the images of the dance between her and the other man stuck in my mind like a poorly done tattoo. The way she smiled, the way she held the glass, the way she tilted her head to hear something he whispered in her ear. It was intimate. It wasn't just flirting. It was surrender. And worst of all, it was natural. As if she'd done it before, more than once. As if that body hadn't been mine alone for a long time. And then, when her eyes met mine and the laughter turned to shock, I understood everything. She was only sorry because I'd been seen. Because she'd found out. Because I'd become a witness. It wasn't guilt, it was fear. For days, I racked my brain trying to pinpoint the exact moment we lost each other. Was it when I started coming home late from work? When I stopped noticing the details of her dress? When her phone started flipping to the bottom? When she started saying she needed space? But none of those questions mattered anymore. Because there, right in front of me, was living proof that someone can fall out of love, and still pretend they can't. She tried calling me. She sent me crying audio messages. She said it meant nothing. That it was silly. That it wasn't what it seemed. But when I asked, in the quietest voice I've ever used in my life, how many times, her silence answered more than any words. It was at that moment I knew I would never return. The following week, I met someone else. A coincidence, an innocent invitation for coffee, a conversation that started lightly and turned deep. She didn't know me in pieces. She saw me whole. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to prove myself. The peace that came with this new love wasn't an escape, it was a choice. A reward, perhaps, for the silence I'd swallowed at that party. Meanwhile, the woman who'd once shared my bed spent her days trying to pick up the pieces of what she'd destroyed. And that's when life, with its silent irony, decided to act. Months later, she appeared. At my doorstep. Hair tied up messily, dark circles under her eyes, and that look of someone who's cried so much that now they just want to be heard. She said she loved me. That she regretted it. That no one had ever made her feel safe like I did. That she was weak, immature, stupid. That the other man was just a novelty. That he was ego, vanity, neediness. That she never wanted to lose what we had. And I believed her. But not because she convinced me. I believed her because I saw the regret was real. Only, it was too late. I was already in a different place. In a different rhythm. With a different woman. With a different peace. I looked into her eyes and said, I forgive you, but now someone else occupies my heart. She cried. She hugged me. And I let her. Because forgiving isn't forgetting. It's remembering without pain. It's understanding that what hurt us taught us to better protect what comes next. But her pain, that was new. Because until then, she'd only known the role of the one who hurts. Now, she felt the wound of the one who loses. And in that moment, I realized, the true punishment for those who betray isn't being betrayed, it's seeing the other move on and be happy with someone who never needed to betray to feel love. She tried to get her life back on track. She sank into failed attempts at reunions. She distanced herself from accomplices, broke with her family out of shame, and isolated herself. And just when she thought she had nothing left to lose, the final blow came. The day she decided to reach out to me again, with the childish hope of a maybe, of a, who knows, that was the day reality hit her hard. I was engaged. She found out by chance, seeing a photo we shared. The smile on my face, the sparkle in my eyes, the kind of happiness she'd never been able to give me, no matter how hard she tried. That image was the final sentence. There were no more messages. No more, I'm sorry. Only silence. A silence that screams every night inside her. Because regret is loud when it finds no answer. And now she lives with it. With the bitter taste of having lost a man who truly loved her. With the memory of a love that was secure, sincere, and whole. And that, in a moment of vanity, she let slip through her fingers. Because sometimes, what we lose out of pride, life shows us will never come back. But there was one thing she didn't know. A truth I carry to this day, hidden from everyone. Something that, if revealed, could have changed everything, or made the outcome even crueler. She never knew what I was going to do at that party, what I had decided that night, what I had in my jacket pocket. Maybe if she had told me sooner, if she had trusted me, if she had chosen differently. Maybe everything would have been different. Or maybe not. But now it's too late to know. And too late to go back. Because that night, at that damned party, I wasn't just a guest. I was there with a plan. One final gesture. One definitive step. And what I took with me, wasn't just my heart. It was something she never could have imagined. Something that would completely change the course of our history. Something that until today, she never knew. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize and never support any type of betrayal. All the stories told are fictional, but they carry a brutal truth. Betrayal destroys lives, corrodes homes and leaves scars that time does not always erase. Our purpose is clear: show, without filters, the real consequences of wrong choices. Now take a deep breath. Prepare your heart. Because what you're about to hear next is an intense, shocking and unforgettable story. His name was Daniel, hers was Laura. And for a long time, they both believed that love was enough to keep any two-person project afloat. They were in their early 20s when they met, both at different stages of life, but with the same hunger for the future. Daniel came from an intense work routine in the technology sector, where he spent hours in front of screens and projects, almost always carrying on his shoulders the weight of someone trying to be someone better than the place he came from. Laura, on the other hand, had the lightness in her eyes of someone who grew up surrounded by affection, yet determined to carve out her own place, professionally involved in marketing and events, communicative, and always surrounded by friends. Their meeting wasn't cinematic, nor was it planned. It was a late afternoon chance, a conversation that began shyly and ended with them both sitting on the sidewalk, laughing about something they'd forgotten about, but which at that moment seemed essential. It wasn't long before they became part of each other's routine, with coffees that lasted all morning, homemade dinners made on the fly, and promises that, at the time, seemed unbreakable. For the first few years, they lived in a small but lively apartment. The walls were adorned with black and white photos of trips they'd taken together, and notes were taped to the fridge with short phrases like, "Is there wine today?" or "I'll be back in 10." Arguments, when they arose, were almost always resolved with silence and long looks, the kind that speak louder than any speech. Daniel was focused, methodical, and had a habit of anticipating possibilities before acting. Laura, on the other hand, was impulsive, passionate about details, the one who would move furniture around at 2 in the morning because she wasn't feeling the energy. And even with their differences, or perhaps because of them, they fit together. They filled each other's gaps. He, more down-to-earth. She, more open-hearted. Little by little, they learned to live with each other's flaws, or perhaps just accustomed to them, like someone accepting a creaking door because they know it's home. When they decided to make their relationship official, there was no elaborate proposal or party. It was during a conversation over breakfast on a rainy Sunday, amid laughter and breadcrumbs, that they decided to move in together. They bought a small apartment downtown and renovated every detail with their own hands. They argued about wall colors and curtain types, but in the end, they smiled when they saw everything finished, as if the space were an extension of them. Daniel took on the role of financial organizer, always aware of bills and deadlines. Laura took care of the emotional details, their parents' birthdays, Christmas presents, and loving notes scattered throughout the house. When friends visited, they often heard compliments about how well they fit together, as if they were made for each other. And for a long time, they believed this with all their might. Life, however, began to take on a different tone as the years passed. The routine became denser. Daniel was promoted, and with it came more hours at the office, more meetings, and fewer dinners at home. Laura also advanced professionally, taking on roles that required more event attendance, shorter trips, and an increasingly busy schedule. Evenings together became rare, breakfasts became hurried, and conversations, once so intimate, became practical. Did you pick up the laundry? Do you have enough rice for dinner? Shall we visit your mother this weekend? Little by little, the connection transformed into coexistence. And coexistence, when not cared for, sickens love. Despite this, there were still gestures of affection. Daniel, even tired, remembered to pick up her favorite sweet from a specific bakery on the other side of town. Laura, in turn, knew when he needed silence, or when all he needed to do was put on his favorite playlist to relieve the stress of the day. But the spontaneous smiles were dwindling. The touch on the arm during conversation was replaced by taps on the phone screen. The midday messages became reminders rather than declarations. And, although neither of them said it out loud, they knew something was changing. It wasn't a lack of love. It was the weight of life crushing the time that was once theirs. Close friends didn't notice. After all, to outsiders, everything seemed fine. They had stability, traveled once or twice a year, and social media photos that showed happy moments. The truth, however, is that the photos were taken on the only days they tried to reconnect. And even on those days, there was a silent effort behind the smiles. Daniel, increasingly caught up in the logic of work, didn't notice the small changes in her behavior. Laura, increasingly involved in social settings and outside agendas, didn't realize the emotional distance she was fostering. When a couple becomes accustomed to silence, it's a sign that communication is no longer a priority. And when that happens, the gaps between one sentence and the next become gaps that are difficult to fill. Still, there was affection. Not the kind of love that bubbles and burns, but the kind of love built together, that respects history, that cherishes the good days. Laura liked to lie on the couch with her head in his lap while he watched some series she didn't even understand, just for the comfort of being near. Daniel, even exhausted, liked to hear her laughter on the phone with her friends, as if it were a reminder that that sound was part of his peace. They looked at each other less, it's true, but there were still light touches, warm hugs upon waking, and the occasional distracted kiss at the end of the day. Time marched on, relentless as ever. New responsibilities and new social circles emerged. Laura began attending more networking events, and Daniel began to decline social invitations more frequently, preferring the refuge of silence. Their differences, once charming, began to become uncomfortable. She wanted more movement, more spontaneity, more excitement. He wanted stability, predictability, tranquility. Even though they hadn't named it, a chasm was beginning to form between them. But, like almost every couple with a history, they chose not to look at it directly. They continued living, moving on, pushing through, as if routine could mask what required confronting. One day, Laura started sleeping later. Daniel noticed, but didn't ask. He preferred to believe it was work. Other times, she started coming home later. The meeting ran long, she'd say. And he, too tired to confront her, accepted it. She, in turn, also noticed his withdrawal, the distant look during dinner, the automatic touches, the lack of initiative for simple things. But she also kept quiet. Not because she didn't care, but because she didn't want to break up. Sometimes, the fear of losing is so great that people prefer to pretend they're not losing. There was one particular Sunday when they were both at home, with time and no commitments. Laura suggested a walk, an attempt to salvage something. Daniel politely declined, claiming tiredness. She didn't insist. He didn't realize how much her refusal hurt. And there, without realizing it, they missed an opportunity to reconnect. Because love also needs to be nurtured. And when it isn't, even the deepest feelings fade. The cycle between them seemed to run on autopilot. And yet, there was care. He always asked if she arrived safely. She left coffee ready in the morning before leaving. These were small kindnesses, but they no longer came with eye contact. Affection became habit. And habit, over time, became the only bond. They still shared the same bed, but with different dreams. They still called each other, my love, but the sound no longer sent shivers. They still said, good morning, but without the same light as before. In this scenario, without fights, without shouting, without scandals, history silently moved toward a fork in the road. And no one noticed. Because when love ends noisily, it's easier to notice. But when it dies peacefully, with polite smiles and hands that no longer reach for each other, it's harder to accept that the end is near. And it was at this point in history that life began to set the stage for what was to come. A choice. A decision. A small, almost imperceptible detour, but one that would change everything. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would ever be the same again. Laura started to smile differently. Not that the smiles had become more frequent, but there was a strange glow in them, a light that didn't come from what she shared with Daniel. It was a smile that appeared alone in the corner of her mouth as she scrolled through her phone or replied to messages between a glass of wine and a long bath. Daniel noticed, but said nothing. It was as if he didn't want to confront the uncomfortable feeling that grew silently inside his chest, as if speaking would make real what he didn't want to believe. Their interaction continued shrouded in polite gestures, carefully chosen words, warm kisses before leaving, and a whispered, good night, that no longer had any effect. The apartment remained organized, the bills paid, the framed photos on the shelf. But there was something off, something invisible, yet palpable. Distancing became routine. Daniel worked late, spent hours immersed in projects that once excited him and now merely numbed him. Laura arrived late from events, with impeccable makeup and smelling of perfume he didn't recognize. She said her commitments were multiplying, her connections were strengthening, that she was finally receiving recognition. He smiled and said he was happy for her, but deep down, a voice whispered a question he refused to ask, recognition from whom? The life that once pulsed between them now ran parallel paths, and even though they still shared the same roof, the feeling of loneliness grew with each passing day. Home ceased to be a refuge and became a place where they avoided looking at each other for too long. One night, Daniel came home early, which was unusual. He carried a bottle of wine and a shy desire to reconnect, perhaps salvage something. He prepared a simple dinner, carefully set the table, and left a shaky note, today I wanted to hear from you, just hear from you. But she didn't show. She texted him saying she needed to extend a commitment with colleagues, something important, something he couldn't refuse. He put away dinner, washed the dishes in silence, and drank his wine alone, watching the street movement through the window as if searching for answers in the lights of passing cars. Her absence that night wasn't the first, but it was the one that hurt differently, as if it had sealed a truth he already knew but hadn't yet accepted. In the days that followed, Laura began sleeping on the opposite side of the bed. She said her back hurt, she needed more space, she wanted to change positions. Daniel didn't question it, he just accepted it, like someone who knows that any discomfort can turn into a confrontation. And he no longer wanted to argue. Not out of weakness, but out of exhaustion. Inside him, everything seemed to be slowly dying: desire, laughter, hope. And when love begins to fade, even silence seems too heavy. It was during a random afternoon, one of those where everything seems too normal to suspect anything, that the idea of catching up with old colleagues came to mind. A work friend invited him to an informal get-together, something impromptu, without much pretension. Daniel hesitated. It wasn't the kind of place I'd been frequenting lately, especially with the weight of everything I was carrying inside. But he decided to go. Maybe to breathe fresh air, maybe to try to remember who he was before. He put on a random shirt, sprayed on perfume without much thought, and left. The venue was a secluded space in the back of an upscale restaurant, with ambient music and people laughing loudly, chatting about goals, travels, and achievements. Daniel tried to blend in, even though he felt out of place. He was greeted enthusiastically by colleagues he hadn't seen in a while, laughed over old stories, and for a few moments, he felt light. But it was when he looked toward the center of the room that time seemed to stand still. Laura. She was there. Beautiful, in a dress he'd never seen before. Her hair loose, her eyes bright, a glass of sparkling wine in her hand. She didn't see him right away, and perhaps that's why she kept dancing with that man, a face unfamiliar to Daniel. The dance wasn't innocent. There was an intimate touch, whispered smiles, gestures that left no room for doubt. It was the kind of connection that hadn't existed between them for a long time. And then, in that instant, her eyes met his. A shock. Her smile faded like wet paint. The glass nearly slipped from her hand. She froze. And so did he. There was no scandal. There was no shouting, no accusation. Daniel simply stared for long seconds, without looking away, without blinking, and then turned and walked away. He passed through the guests like a ghost. No one stopped him. No one noticed the pain. Outside, the air seemed thicker. He walked aimlessly, with firm steps, his heart shattered. There was no longer room for doubt, for assumptions. Betrayal was no longer a fear. It was a fact. And what hurt most was not the act itself, but the realization that everything they had built had been discarded by her with an ease he never imagined. When he got home, he sat on the couch for hours, silent. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just stared into space, trying to understand when everything had gone wrong. The apartment seemed colder, emptier, as if there was no longer any trace of life there. And then, he made the decision. He would leave. Not impulsively, but definitively. He would leave no trace, no questions. He would hand over the key, pack his things, and start over. Because love isn't about accepting everything. And he knew he deserved more than the remnants of someone's presence. In the days that followed, Laura tried to contact him. She sent messages trying to explain, saying it wasn't what it seemed, that she was confused, that it was a mistake. Daniel read everything but didn't respond. Silence was his form of protection. Mutual friends began to notice the distance, but he avoided talking about what happened. He kept his pain, grief, and anger to himself. And also a secret. A detail of that night that no one but him knew. Something he held on to like someone holding an open wound, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. As Laura plunged into the desperation of trying to recover something that had been destroyed by her own hands, Daniel grew increasingly distant. He began to change his habits, his places, his companions. And on one of these new paths, he met someone. There was no pretense, no rush. But there was a lightness. A conversation that flowed effortlessly, a gaze that didn't demand anything, a presence that comforted. For the first time in a long time, he felt seen. Not as someone broken, but as someone whole, even with all the scars. The betrayal wasn't the end of the pain. It was the beginning of rebuilding. But Laura didn't know that yet. She believed she could still recover. That there was still time. And it was this miscalculation that would make everything even more painful. Because there was something more that night. Something Daniel carried with him. Something that would change everything when it came to light. Laura waited for days for a reaction, a message, any sign that there was still a chance, that Daniel's silence was just the time needed to digest the pain and, perhaps, make room for forgiveness. But time passed like an endless winter. Each dragged-out hour reinforced his absence. The photos disappeared from the bookshelf. The clothes from the closet. And when she arrived home on a cloudy afternoon and found his key on the kitchen table, next to a sealed envelope with his name on it, she felt the ground give way beneath her feet. There was no letter inside, just the signed property division agreement and a receipt for the transfer of his share of the apartment. No explanation, no scream, just the echo of the definitive choice of someone who no longer wants to fight. But what she didn't know, what she never imagined, was what he had brought with him that night at the party. The truth that would hide until it became impossible to hold it back. The revelation wouldn't come in a fit of outrage, nor on impulse. It would come the moment he was whole again. And that moment arrived. 3 months later, on a warm spring afternoon, as she walked distractedly down a street they often frequented, she saw in the distance a scene that made her body freeze. It was Daniel, leaving a flower shop with a small bouquet in his hands, smiling serenely. Beside him, a woman. Different from her in every way. Her hair tied in a carefree bun, a simple blouse, a calm gaze. They walked slowly, as if in no hurry to arrive, and stopped in front of a random storefront. He said something, she laughed. And then he touched her face with the back of his hand, with the gentleness of someone caring for something they love. Laura didn't have the courage to approach. She just watched. And he felt a sharp pain in his chest, as if something were being ripped out by the roots. It wasn't just jealousy. It was recognition. The cruel recognition that he was happy. And it wasn't with her. Another week passed before she summoned the courage to seek him out. Not for the chance to reconnect, but because she needed to hear. She needed to know how he felt. She needed to understand why this had happened. She sent a short message, asking for just a few minutes. He responded the next day with a time and a location. It was a discreet cafe, far from the city center. When she arrived, he was already there. Sitting at the back table, his hands clasped on the wood, waiting. She approached slowly, her shoulders hunched, her eyes weary, as if carrying months of insomnia and regret. The conversation began tensely, with few words. She asked if he was okay. He said yes. She mentioned that she'd heard he'd met someone. He confirmed with a slight, almost indifferent gesture. And then silence fell between them for a few seconds that felt like hours. Until she finally blurted out, her voice breaking, that she regretted it. She said she'd made a mistake, that she didn't know what she was doing, that she'd felt empty since he left. He listened silently, his eyes fixed on her, without interjections, without interruptions. When she finished, tears in her eyes, he took a deep breath, leaned back in his chair, and, with a firmness she'd never seen before, began to speak. He told her that night at the party, he had gone with a purpose. That he had been invited by chance, but that he accepted because, that very day, he had made a decision. He had spent weeks thinking about how to take an important step, something that could rekindle the connection between them. He said that, just before leaving home, he had written a letter, tucked it into his jacket pocket, and placed a small velvet box at the bottom of his wallet. It wasn't just a gift. It was a request. A gesture of a new beginning. He wanted to renew their vows, to rescue them both from the routine that consumed them. He had chosen that night to surprise her, to tell her that despite everything, he still believed in them. And as he said this, he took a crumpled photo from his inside pocket. It was the image of the wedding ring he had custom-made, with the inscription, "I would still choose you." He showed her the image on his phone, which still had the jewelry store's email address. She put her hands over her mouth, unable to contain her tears. Then he continued. He said that when he arrived at that party and saw her with another man, dancing, laughing, making intimate gestures to a stranger, the first thing he felt wasn't anger. It was deep pain. A definitive breakdown. He didn't just witness a betrayal. He witnessed the exact moment he stopped believing. And it was in that instant, with the box still in his pocket, with the letter still tucked away, that he understood that the love he felt for her was no longer enough. The image of her with another man wasn't just a jealous image. It was proof that he'd been alone in that relationship for much longer than he'd thought. And that she'd already given up before he'd even tried to save it. Laura couldn't hold back her tears. She tried to speak, but no words made sense. He looked at her serenely, like someone who's cried all they needed to and now just wants to move on in peace. She apologized, saying she had no idea, that if she'd known, she would have acted differently. But he calmly replied that the problem was precisely that, she would only have acted differently if she'd known he was about to do something big. And that said it all. Because true love doesn't wait for surprises to be faithful. True love doesn't need threats, nor expectations. It just is. She asked if there was any chance. Just one, even a small one. He smiled sadly and said he forgave her. That he no longer held any resentment, that the resentment was gone. But he added that time had passed. And that, in that time, he had found something he thought was lost, the ability to be happy with someone who, even without knowing his pain, welcomed him completely. He said that now someone else occupied the space that had once been hers. That this place was not replaceable, but renewable. And that he had chosen to move on. The silence stretched for a few seconds. Laura simply nodded, wiping away her tears with trembling hands. He stood, left the payment on the table, and before leaving, said something that would stay with her forever. He said he loved her with everything he had, but that love, when betrayed, doesn't die. It just changes address. She stood there, alone, staring at her cold cup of coffee. And she knew, in that moment, that she had lost much more than a partner. She had lost a future. A story that could have been. And that would never be again. Because the kind of pain Daniel felt that night would never return. And what she never imagined was that time, which she believed she could control, would be the same time that would teach her the value of something when it can no longer be had. Laura didn't return home after that coffee. She walked aimlessly through streets she knew with her eyes closed, but which now seemed foreign, as if every corner carried the weight of what she hadn't seen in time. Her face, still damp with tears, dried in the warm afternoon wind, but inside, everything inside her was crumbling. Daniel's words echoed with a deafening silence. He had come to her that night with an open heart, willing to start over, to give all that remained of love. And she, blinded by her own desires, her inflated ego, and the needs she never knew how to name, was in the arms of another, laughing at something insignificant, while the man who loved her held in his pocket the chance that could have changed everything. She felt ashamed. Of herself, of the choices she'd made, of the way she'd trivialized everything that had once been true. She always thought she'd have time, that Daniel would be there, even when she was no longer whole. She thought love endured on its own, that it didn't need daily reciprocity. And there, faced with living proof that he had moved on without her, she understood that love, even deep love, cannot survive where there is no care. The following days were difficult. She returned to the apartment and found it emptier than she remembered. Not just physically, he had taken few things, but emotionally. The space felt different. Cold, silent, charged with a noisy absence. The paintings still hung on the walls, but she couldn't bring herself to look at them. Every object in the room seemed to scream his name, recalling moments that now seemed distant, almost imagined. She began sleeping on the couch. She avoided the bedroom like someone avoiding a battlefield. The bed still had his scent mingled with hers. It was a daily torture. She tried to fill her time with work, with household chores, with anything that would keep her from thinking. But thinking was inevitable. She mentally revisited every moment of the past few months, every sign she ignored, every word she didn't say, every time she chose the phone over conversation, absence over presence. One cloudy morning, she decided to visit her mother. It was an attempt to breathe fresh air, to seek some solace she wasn't even sure she wanted. Her mother welcomed her with a long hug, the kind that doesn't require questions. They sat in the backyard, drinking coffee in silence. When she finally spoke, she broke down. She told him everything. About the distance, the betrayal, the discovery, the coffee with Daniel, the secret he revealed. And then came the hardest part, admitting that she had lost the man of her life through choices that now no longer made sense. Her mother listened to everything with teary eyes, without judging, without interrupting. When Laura finished, in a whisper, she simply said, "Daughter, love is also protecting the other from yourself. You didn't know how to protect them." These words pierced Laura like a dagger. Not because they came from her mother, but because they were too true to ignore. That night, she returned home and wrote a letter. Not with the intention of getting Daniel back, she knew that time had passed, but to empty her heart, to try to understand, in words, what she hadn't been able to say when there was still time. She wrote about the good times, about the memories that were now hers alone, about how selfish, thoughtless, and immature she had been. She apologized, not for the betrayal itself, but for not caring for the love she had received. She said that if she could go back, she would do everything differently, but that she understood that sometimes forgiveness comes without return, and that she would respect that. She didn't send the letter. She tucked it away in a drawer, along with old photos, as a way of burying once and for all what would never return. Meanwhile, Daniel moved on with his new life with ease. There was no rush, no guilt. The woman he was with was the opposite of what he had with Laura. Not because she was better or more affectionate, but because there was peace. They talked with their eyes, laughed at simple things, there was no pressure. He still bore the scars of what he had experienced, but he didn't let those scars define him. He built a relationship based on presence, and that was enough. He avoided places he frequented with Laura, not out of pain, but out of respect for his own reconstruction. He had accepted the end, forgiven the past, and embraced the new with courage. A few months later, chance decided to bring them face to face again. It was a gathering of mutual friends, a small, informal gathering. Daniel hadn't known Laura would be there. And when she saw him enter, she felt her entire body shiver. He was different. Lighter, more handsome, more himself. He was accompanied, and the two exchanged knowing, discreet glances, as if living a story that doesn't need to be revealed to prove its existence. Laura, alone, greeted him politely. He responded kindly. They spoke briefly, without tension, without rancor. She smiled, and so did he. But there was something there that said more than any words, there was peace between them, but there was no longer any place. After that day, she didn't seek him out again. Nor did he. It was as if they had ended what was left there, without formality. An end that came late, but still in time to not hurt more than had already been hurt. Laura moved on with her life. She tried new relationships, some lasting weeks, others months. None of them touched what Daniel had touched. He, in turn, matured in the new relationship, building it calmly, without ghosts, but with learning. The pain became a memory. And the memory became a lesson. Years later, Laura learned of Daniel's marriage. She didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes for a few seconds and silently wished him happiness. She had changed too. She learned to listen to herself, to understand what she sought in others that she lacked in herself. She never again allowed neediness to guide her decisions. She never again confused attention with love. And, most importantly, she never again stopped seeing someone who loved her. Sometimes, on cold nights, he still reads the letter he wrote. Those words are a reminder of how much you lost by not knowing how to appreciate what you had. But they are also the reflection of a woman who learned from her fall. A woman who, even marked by regret, chose to move on. Because, in the end, life doesn't go back. But it always teaches. And what Daniel carried that night, in his jacket pocket, wasn't just a ring or a letter. It was the last chance for a love he still believed in. The last attempt to save a story. And Laura only discovered this when it was too late. When the dance with another man cost her more than she imagined. It cost her the future she could have had. And, like every choice, it came with a price. The price of seeing the other person happy, with someone who never needed to be forgiven. Laura began to live amid absences. Not only Daniel's, but the absence of herself as she once knew it. The end of that cycle was like a silent earthquake, the kind that doesn't knock down the walls from the outside, but cracks the structure from the inside. Time was no longer divided between appointments and laughter, but between reflections and long silences, most of them unanswered. Sometimes, between the traffic and the cold morning coffee, she found herself remembering simple scenes, details that now hurt her more than the memory of the betrayal itself. The way he placed his hand on her back when they were walking down the street, the comfortable silence they shared before bed, the sense of security that came when he said, in an almost distracted tone, that she was his home. That was what hurt. Not the loss of the relationship as it ended, but the vivid memory of everything she had been before she lost herself. And that's where the dilemma arose: how could she forgive herself for destroying something so pure, without anyone forcing her, without violence, without fighting, without anything to justify it? She had the best kind of love and treated it as if it were disposable. She began to frequent places she'd avoided. Not in an attempt to find him again, but as a kind of silent punishment, a quest to confront herself. She returned to the restaurant where they'd celebrated a birthday together, sat alone, ordered the same dish, and couldn't finish it. She visited the bookstore where he bought books and remembered the hours he'd read aloud passages he found too beautiful to keep to himself. She spent her Sundays walking aimlessly, as if trying to retrace her own steps. She told no one about the conversation at the cafe. Not even her best friend, with whom she'd shared every detail of the separation. She felt that moment was sacred, a definitive closure, almost too intimate to be exposed. Because there was no room for argument or drama. There was maturity. A painful maturity that forced her to accept that not all mistakes can be reversed. Meanwhile, Daniel continued building a new life that didn't need to erase the old one to exist. He didn't run from what he'd experienced, but used each scar as a reminder of what he could no longer ignore. If before he tolerated dangerous silences, now he insisted on talking. If before he expected love to sustain itself, now he watered the new with presence. He no longer idealized anyone, nor did he expect perfection. But he demanded truth. And this demand wasn't imposed on his new partner, but on himself. He no longer wanted to settle for half-heartedness, no longer wanted to be the only one trying to save something. He had finally discovered the value of being with someone who chooses to stay even when it would be easier to leave. Laura didn't try to contact him again. But the memory of what he'd revealed at the cafe was still like a blade in her mind. Knowing he'd gone to that party with a request for a fresh start in his pockets, while she'd betrayed him on the dance floor, was an image that hurt more every day. She couldn't imagine how he'd managed to keep the letter and the ring silent for so long. And it was precisely that silence that taught her more than any argument could have. Because, in that silence, there was dignity. And that was everything she lacked when she chose to follow her impulses instead of protecting those she loved. Over time, she began trying to rebuild her life. She met new people, had a few dates, and even began a brief relationship that soon ended due to incompatibility. She realized that she was searching, in each new face, for some shadow of Daniel. A gesture, a way of laughing, even the way he crossed his arms. And, upon realizing this, she understood that she wasn't ready yet. There was still a pain inside her that hadn't fully transformed into learning. Because, although she had already understood what she had lost, she still hadn't forgiven herself for being the cause of it. It was then that she began to write. Not letters, not messages. She wrote to herself. Texts that would never be published, but that helped her express what she couldn't explain to anyone. She wrote about guilt, about self-sabotage, about the fear of being loved and not knowing how to deal with it. She wrote about vanity, about the moments when she was cruel without realizing it, about the times when she preferred to be desired by strangers rather than valued by those who knew her completely. And in these pages, she discovered a new version of herself. A more conscious, more attentive, less impulsive woman. But still wounded. Still scarred. One day, she received an unexpected call. It was the wife of a distant cousin, with whom Laura barely spoke. She said she'd seen Daniel at a family event and that he seemed genuinely happy. Laura thanked her, with a lump in her throat, and hung up. Afterward, she stood there staring out the window for long minutes, absorbing that feeling of being a spectator to his life, of knowing that, somewhere, he was smiling without pain. There was no envy, no jealousy. There was only a silent regret for not having been part of this new chapter. She thought about what it would have been like if she'd made different choices, if she'd recognized his value before losing him, if she'd chosen to stay, talk, fight. But time offers no make-up. And that's perhaps the cruelest part of life, it goes on. Daniel's sister got pregnant, and Laura found out through social media. She saw photos of his new partner hugging her future sister-in-law, smiling naturally, as if she'd been part of the family for years. It was like a second morning. Not for life itself, but for the certainty that she had been completely replaced. That the space she once occupied with such pride now belonged to another woman. And the most devastating thing was knowing that this woman never had to make any effort to take her place. She was simply there, at the right time, with her whole heart. The dilemma Laura faced at that point in the story was no longer about how to win Daniel back. It was deeper. It was about how to continue being who you were now, after everything you'd learned, without carrying that weight like an anchor. He knew regret couldn't be his sole identity. But he also couldn't free himself from something that still hurt. He had learned to walk with the pain, like someone learning to walk with a wound that won't heal but won't bleed anymore. And in the process, he became more human. More empathetic. He began to listen more, to judge less, to see in others' small flaws the reflections of his own. Daniel, on the other hand, never returned to the past. He put the letter he had written to Laura that night in a box along with other souvenirs and sealed it with tape. He put the box in the back of the closet and never opened it again. Not out of anger, but because it was no longer part of who he was. The new phase of his life required presence, lightness, and surrender, things the past could no longer offer. He still bore the marks, yes, but he no longer touched them often. They were there, like old scars, which no longer hurt, but which remind us of what we've been through. At some point, Laura received an invitation to a wedding. It was from a couple of mutual friends, the kind who still insisted on maintaining ties with each other, even with the past between them. She hesitated, but decided to go. She wanted to prove to herself that she was ready. When she arrived at the ceremony, she saw Daniel from afar. He was elegant, calm, smiling. The new partner beside him, with a serene aura, seemed made for him. Laura sat apart, inconspicuous. She watched the entire ceremony with a heavy but firm heart. At the end, as the bride and groom greeted the guests, Daniel and she passed by chance. They exchanged a quick glance, a polite smile. And that was enough. They didn't need to say anything. They both knew their story had reached its end. But now, without pain. That night, back home, Laura opened a new notebook and wrote a single sentence: "The love I lost taught me how to truly love." She closed the notebook, took a deep breath, and turned out the light. For the first time in a long time, she slept peacefully. Because she finally understood that some losses don't come to punish us. They come to transform us. And that the true moral dilemma isn't the mistake itself, but what we choose to do with it afterward. And Laura had chosen to grow. Even if she would never love anyone again the way she loved Daniel, at least now she knew how to love. And that, perhaps, would be enough to start over. Laura began to rebuild herself the only way she knew how, living her days with a mixture of resignation and lucidity, as if accepting that there was nothing left to redeem, but still needing to carry on. Time didn't go back, the choices didn't change, and what was said couldn't be unsaid. But, curiously, it was precisely this absence of return that pushed her toward a deeper understanding of herself. She was no longer the woman who made that mistake, nor the one who begged for forgiveness. Now, she was someone between grief and maturity, someone who observed the world more starkly, but also more honestly. Clarity came with pain, yes, but a pain that no longer immobilized. She had stopped trying to understand what would make Daniel return and began to wonder what had prevented her from seeing who he was while he was still by her side. The nights became less unbearable. The silence of the house, once suffocating, became more neutral. The chants that screamed his name now only reminded her of stories. They didn't hurt like before, but they also brought no comfort. They were what they were, memories. And with this acceptance came new movements. She began going out more, not to escape, but in an attempt to recapture the taste of her own company. She went to exhibitions, walked through neighborhoods she avoided, entered cafes that seemed unfamiliar even though she'd passed them 1,000 times. Sometimes she would sit alone for hours, simply observing people, imagining stories, trying to understand what unites and what separates human beings. It was as if she wanted to understand where, exactly, love slips away, at what point it stops being cared for and starts being taken for granted. And, over time, she understood that the answer didn't come with a date or an explanation. It came in the sum of unnoticed absences, unrequited gestures, and unspoken words. One rainy autumn afternoon, while visiting a small bookstore on a street she rarely passed, Laura found something unexpected. Leafing through a book of contemporary poetry, she found a simple dedication written in blue pen on the title page, "For those who have learned that love must be chosen every day." It froze her for a moment. It wasn't Daniel's handwriting, nor was there any sign of him there. But that sentence struck her as if it had been written directly to her. As if it were a cruel and necessary mirror. She left the bookstore with the book in her hands and spent the rest of the day rereading that sentence, as if it could stitch together some still open part of her heart. The following week, she ran into a former coworker by chance, a woman she'd never been very close to but whom she'd always admired for her firm, level-headed demeanor. They chatted about trivialities at first, until Laura, driven by a strange impulse, confessed she'd made a mistake that cost her the love of her life. Her colleague listened without judgment, with surprising attention. And, in the end, she simply said, "Pain is fair when it teaches." What will you do with what you've learned? Laura didn't know how to answer at the time. But that question stayed with her in the following days, repeating itself like a mantra. What to do with what has been learned? Shortly after, she learned through a mutual friend that Daniel had moved to another, more remote, quieter neighborhood. He had adopted a dog with his new partner and was organizing a small dinner to announce their engagement to those closest to him. Hearing this, she didn't cry. She simply took a deep breath and murmured, "That's great." It was sincere, yet filled with a void that would never be filled. She no longer expected to return, but she still felt the weight of what could have been. Life went on, but not on the same path. An unexpected invitation arrived a few weeks later. It was from a friend Laura hadn't seen in a long time, one of those old friendships that have survived the test of time, but which divergent paths eventually separated. The invitation was for a retreat of silence and introspection, outside the city, 3 days in a place far from everything. She hesitated, but accepted. Not for the idea of silence, that was already her companion, but for the challenge of facing that silence in a new setting, away from distractions. On that trip, between solitary walks, notes in a worn notebook, and conversations with strangers, Laura once again confronted the most difficult part of the human experience, dealing with what cannot be undone. An older woman, with whom she shared a meal on the third day, said something that deeply affected her. Speaking of loss, she said she learned to love what she lost, not as someone who longs for it to return, but as someone who honors its existence. Sometimes, the pain doesn't leave us. But it changes form. It becomes a kind of memory that carries respect. Laura smiled. That was it. It wasn't about forgetting, nor about punishing herself forever. It was about looking back without needing to hide. Upon returning from the retreat, she found a simple letter in the mailbox, with no return address. He recognized Daniel's mother's handwriting. He opened it with trembling hands. It was just a few lines. It said that, despite everything, he still remembered her fondly and that he wished Laura peace. This broke something inside. She cried alone for hours, not because of what it might mean in terms of reconciliation, but because she felt, for the first time, that perhaps she wasn't hated. And that this, in itself, was a gift. She finally understood that true forgiveness doesn't come when guilt is forgiven, but when the one who was hurt no longer carries the venom. And, realizing she was still remembered kindly, she felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in a long time. In the following weeks, Laura began to live with more presence. She created new habits, read more, and started writing again. Her writing, previously dense and guilt-ridden, now took on softer, yet nostalgic, lines. She no longer sought answers, she simply expressed them. She became involved in social projects and volunteer activities, as if seeking to give back to the world what she had failed to care for. There was no intention of public remorse in this. It was simply a new way of loving. Not someone, but herself, life, and moments. Daniel was no longer a ghost. He was a memory that shaped her. One day, after leaving a short literature lecture, she ran into the colleague she had heard weeks earlier. They chatted for a few minutes, and the woman said something simple but powerful: "You seem different. More whole." Laura simply thanked her, but deep down, she felt that this was perhaps the most accurate description anyone had given her since the end. She was no longer someone searching for what she had lost. She was someone inhabiting what she had become. There were, of course, still nights when she dreamed about him. But not like before, when the dream was tinged with pain or guilt. Now, the dreams were more like framed memories, scenes from a time when she was happy, and even if it didn't last forever, it had the value it deserved. And this acceptance was liberating. And so, Laura continued. She knew life would never be the same again, but she also knew she now lived with more truth. And truth, sometimes, hurts. But it also frees. And, in time, she would understand that true forgiveness is what we give ourselves, not to forget, but to move on. Time passed without fanfare, as it always does when it decides to bury what has passed. Life continued on, as if nothing had made a sound, as if the deepest ruptures left no visible trace, as if pain always needed to hide behind commitments, routine, and days that repeat themselves. Daniel was now a married man. The ceremony was simple, but charged with raw emotion, a serenity that came not from the euphoria of the moment, but from the silent certainty that he had found the peace he had sought for so long in all the wrong places. He held the hands of the woman beside him with the same confidence a castaway clutches a plank at sea, but with the difference that, this time, he wasn't saving himself from the sea, he was choosing where he wanted to dock. The looks exchanged between them didn't scream unbridled passion, but rather something more mature, more stable. They spoke of commitment. The kind of love that doesn't need an audience to exist, nor justifications to endure. In the new home they shared, mornings were filled with hot coffee and light conversation. There was laughter, there were plans, but above all, there was presence. She knew how to listen to his silences, and he knew how not to invade hers. There were no demands from the past, no deep-rooted fears. There were choices. And Daniel, who once thought he would never love deeply again, now understood that pain had not killed his ability to love, it had simply taught him to love better. The traumas he carried no longer weighed heavily, not because they had disappeared, but because they had been respected. And the new love knew how not to compete with the old. It knew how to exist with him, beside him, without trying to nullify him. It was this respect that transformed what was wound into history. And what was history into strength. Laura had already changed homes, jobs, and social circles. Not out of escape, but out of necessity. She understood that staying in the same places was like remaining at the scene of a crime she herself committed. There was something cruel about waking up every day surrounded by the memories of a love she couldn't preserve, of a future she couldn't build. So she decided to start over in a concrete way. She moved to a quieter neighborhood, accepted a less stressful position, and dedicated herself to writing more consistently. Writing became not only a refuge, but a way to purge pain, to transform regret into something that could, at least in the slightest, serve someone. She began contributing to independent magazines, writing chronicles about choices, about time, about the pain no one sees. She never signed her name with her full name. It was as if she still wanted to shield a part of herself from the judgment of others, even though she no longer feared being judged as much. One day, sitting in a nearly empty coffee shop, she heard someone in the background reading aloud from one of her chronicles, unaware that the author was just a few feet away. The text spoke of loss, but not romantic loss, it spoke of losing oneself amidst one's own decisions. Laura listened without turning around. She stood there, motionless, letting the words echo. And she felt something strange. It wasn't pain. It was a quiet form of pride. The certainty that, although she couldn't fix what she'd done, at least she was no longer pretending to be someone she wasn't. She was trying, with all her might, to be someone better. And maybe that was all she could do. Fate, with its silent way of creating unlikely encounters, decided to place Laura and Daniel in the same room once again. It was during a lecture on ethics in human relations, hosted by an institute that encouraged contemporary reflections on behavior and emotional bonds. Both had been invited by different means. Daniel as a listener, interested in topics that could help him in his work with team development. Laura as a participant in a discussion group on writing and emotional reconstruction. When their eyes met in the entrance hall, there was no shock. There was no tension. There was only a calm, mature recognition, of someone who no longer expected anything from the other, but who still recognized the importance of what they had experienced. At the end of the event, they approached each other. They exchanged polite greetings. Laura commented on the lecture's content, Daniel praised the most recent article he'd read, yes, he'd heard she wrote. Not by chance. Out of curiosity, he looked up a text mutual friends had shared and recognized, in those words, the new version of herself. They talked for a few minutes, and when silence threatened to fall between them, Laura, with a calm look, said she hadn't expected him to read anything she'd written. Daniel simply replied that, upon reading, he understood she had, in fact, changed. But even so, some things couldn't be undone. She nodded. Not as if apologizing, but as if accepting. And then he said goodbye, wishing she would continue writing, because her words now felt good. And he left. Laura stood still for a few moments, feeling the wind blow through her hair, watching Daniel disappear down the sidewalk with the same ease with which he had entered her life years before. There was no more room for regret. All that remained was gratitude. And with that gratitude, she returned home that night, opened her notebook, and wrote one last chronicle about him. Not about the pain, nor the guilt. But about the kind of love that teaches even after the end. A story about what is lost, but also about what is learned. She didn't mention names. She didn't share details. She simply wrote, "He loved me at my worst." And because of that, today, I am a better person. And so, life went on for both of them. Daniel built his family with the care he learned from loss. He had children, teaching them about honesty, listening, and commitment. He didn't talk about Laura, not because he hid it, but because there was no reason to. It was a part of his history that belonged to the past, but contributed to the present. His new wife never had to compete with a shadow. And this made her a secure woman. Their relationship was built on transparency. And that was precisely what made everything solid. Laura remained alone for a while, but not lonely. She learned to be self-sufficient, to find joy in what once seemed trivial. She began giving lectures, mentoring young writers, and talking about how decisions shape destinies. Sometimes I looked back and it still hurt. But it hurt less. It hurt in a different way. In a more human, more accepting way. It was the pain of someone who lost something valuable, yes, but who at least knew how to make sense of the loss. Over time, she also allowed herself to love again. A calmer, slower, more caring love. Someone who didn't idealize her, but who accepted her with her scars, her pain, her history. Someone who met Laura after the chaos, and still wanted to stay. And because of that, she knew how to appreciate it. And she never made the same mistakes again. And that's the most brutal and beautiful truth of this story. Sometimes, the love of your life isn't the one you break up with. But it's the one who transforms you for the love that comes after. Daniel and Laura didn't get back together. But somehow, each experienced what they needed to. And, in the end, they found peace. Because the forgiveness you offer to another is what frees you. But the forgiveness you give to yourself is what heals you. If you've listened to this story so far, comment below with your thoughts. Which part touched you most? What would you have done in their place? Your opinion is very important. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to continue following stories like this, intense, real, human. And let this story serve as a reminder, betrayal doesn't just destroy relationships. It destroys the gaze, the trust, the plans, the details. It breaks bonds that, often, will never be rebuilt. Time may pass, life may go on, but some choices leave permanent scars. And all for something that, almost always, wasn't even worth that much. This channel does not support, normalize, or romanticize any type of betrayal. Our goal is clear, to show that those who don't take care of the love they have can lose it forever. Because love is an ongoing act. It's a daily choice. And that's exactly what makes love so rare, and so precious.